for re-election after this editorial. And I go to my local television station and I say, I want to run a political ad. And they say, no. The New York Times says you're an ignorant slut. We're not going to run your ad. Can they do that?
I think that's governed. That's governed by different laws pertaining to the airwaves, which are governed by federal statutes.
There's only one Constitution.
That's right.
How can a news organization deny me the right to reply to an editorial that denigrates me, but yet I have a right to run a television ad that says the New York Times is wrong?
I think in order to have permission to use the airwaves, I think federal law requires TV stations to give equal time or equal opportunity to buy ads.
Why is that constitutional?
Well, it's constitutional because my understanding, at least, is that the federal government controls the airwaves. Essentially, are federal property that the federal government can regulate and authorize the use of.
Yeah, but the federal government has to abide by the First Amendment, doesn't it?
It does.
I don't know. Explain to me how the New York Times can say no to me wanting a right of reply, but a TV station can't prohibit me from replying.
Senator, my understanding of the law is that the airwaves would be a public resource that
Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana has a reputation for a questioning style that combines humor, bluntness, and an uncanny ability to draw judicial nominees into constitutional puzzles that move quickly from the practical to the philosophical. In the hearing segment under review, Kennedy engages nominees Mr. Meredith and Mr. Mercer on topics that range from controversial gubernatorial pardons to the intricacies of First Amendment protections, federal broadcast regulations, common carrier doctrines, and the constitutional limits of local zoning laws. What begins as a seemingly narrow inquiry into whether a governor's pardons were investigated by the FBI spirals outward into some of the deepest questions in American constitutional law. What does the First Amendment protect and what does it not? Can Congress override local zoning laws to address national housing shortages? At what point does a local government's regulatory fee transform into an unconstitutional taking under the Fifth Amendment? Kennedy's questions are not random. They reflect core tensions in American governance: federal power versus state and local authority, individual speech rights versus editorial discretion, and the balance between private enterprise and public regulatory structures. This commentary will unpack the legal and political dynamics in this exchange, exploring not only what was said, but what it reveals about the evolving state of constitutional interpretation
Meredith,
in the United States.
You worked for Governor Bevin?
Yes, Senator.
You were his lawyer?
I was one of the lawyers in the office, Senator.
Okay. Governor Bevin issued some controversial pardons, is that right?
He did, Senator.
The FBI investigated those pardons, did it not?
Yes, Senator, that's right.
Did the FBI file charges against Governor Bevin?
My understanding is they did not, Senator.
Okay. Did you advise Governor Bevin on any of those controversial pardons?
The only controversial pardon that I advised him on was one for Mr. Irvin Edge, and I recommended that Mr. Edge not be pardoned.
And was he pardoned?
My understanding from reading news articles is that he was pardoned.
Okay, so the governor didn't take your advice?
Apparently not, Senator.
Okay. But you didn't have anything to do with any of the other controversial pardons?
No, Senator.
Okay. If the New York Times, Mr. Meredith, published an editorial, let's suppose it said, Senator Kennedy is a bad senator. We don't like him. We think he's an ignorant slut. And I called the New York Times and I said, okay, I want to write a letter to the editor replying. Can the New York Times tell me no?
I believe they could tell you no, Senator.
Well, what if I said, if they told me no, I said, okay, I want to buy a full-page ad that says John Kennedy's a good senator. He is not an ignorant slut. And they said no. Can they do that?
I think the First Amendment would allow them to exercise editorial discretion and control over the types of ads they want to sell.
You think it's purely a First Amendment case?
There could be, I mean, I think there are potentially other laws that could govern how they make their decisions to sell ads, but I think if they're making a decision about whether you can buy an ad that says Senator Kennedy's a good senator, I think I think the First Amendment would allow them to exercise.
Suppose I'm running for re-election after this editorial, and I go to my local television station and I say I want to run a political ad, and they say no. The New York Times says you're an ignorant slut. We're not going to run your ad. Can they do that?
I think that's governed. That's governed by different laws pertaining to the airwaves, which are
There's
governed by
only
federal
one
statutes.
Constitution.
That's right.
How can a news organization deny me the right to reply to an editorial that denigrates me, but yet I have a right to run a television ad that says the New York Times is wrong?
I think in order to have permission to use the airwaves, I think federal law requires TV stations to give equal time or equal opportunity to buy ads.
Why is that constitutional?
Well, it's constitutional because my understanding, at least, is that the federal government controls the airwaves. Essentially, are federal property that the federal government can regulate and authorize the use of.
Yeah, but the federal
airwaves.
government has to abide by the First Amendment, doesn't it?
It does,
I don't know.
Senator.
Explain to me how the New York Times can say no to me wanting a right of reply, but a TV station can't prohibit me from replying.
Senator, my understanding of the law is that the airwaves would be a public resource that the federal government regulates.
You think they're a common carrier?
I don't know the law on this specifically, Senator. I don't know that the common carrier analysis would apply there. Perhaps it would. I don't know.
Well, suppose I have my cell phone service with AT&T, and I call AT&T, and I say I want to expand my cell phone service, and they say nope. We read that New York Times article. You can't do it. Can AT&T turn me down?
I think theoretically they probably could.
No. How? Why? What basis?
Well, I take that back. You're right. They probably can't because it's the same thing.
Why?
They're using the airwaves as well.
They're a common carrier, right?
I think that analysis probably applies there. That's right.
Okay. Mr. Mercer, can Congress pass a law that says cities are no longer able to participate in zoning? We're going to take it over at the federal level because we don't have enough houses. Would that be constitutional?
Senator Kennedy, I don't believe it would be.
Why not?
I believe that's the sort of thing that the Constitution has, not given Congress the authority under Article 1 to do that. And in fact,
Why not? On what basis?
in our system of federalism, those things that are not set forth in the Constitution are reserved to the states. And zoning is one of those quintessential public health, safety, welfare matters that we reserve to local government to resolve. And so I don't believe it would be permissible for this body to attempt to codify something in that regard.
So local government would win in that instance.
That is my understanding.
Okay,
Senator.
suppose local government came back and said, not only now that we've won and we have jurisdiction over our own zoning and our own housing laws, if you want to build a new house in our city, the permit is now $50,000. Can they do that?
Senator, essentially, I think the same analysis applies. I think that the local government would have the ability to establish that, and I don't think Congress could overrule it, and I think they would have the inherent authority to do so.
Why isn't that a taking under the United States Constitution and the Fifth Amendment?
Senator, that would be a whole different analysis, but I don't believe.
Same analysis. We just established they have the right to zone as they wish, and so and to regulate local housing. They're doing it. They're saying $50,000 to get a building permit. You're telling me that's constitutional?
Senator, I believe it would be. I think that they could establish that they need, in order to engage in the permitting process and go through what they need to do as a local government. I doubt very much whether that would be a violation under a compensable taking under the Fifth Amendment.
You familiar with Sheets v. County of El Dorado?
Senator, no, I'm not. That is not something that I've encountered in my practice.
The Supreme Court struck down a $23,420 fee for a permit to build a home.
I was not familiar with that precedent, Senator. I'll make sure.
At some point, local government, which has wide discretion when exercising its police power, at some point, their actions can step over the line, can they not?
That is true, Senator. And
violate what? The takings clause?
In this case, I'm not familiar with if Sheets was based upon the Fifth Amendment or if there was some other analysis, but.
It was Fifth Amendment.
Okay.
Y'all hungry? I am.
Yes, Senator.
Okay. All right, gentlemen, thank you. Thanks to all the nominees today. Written questions for the record may be submitted until August 6th at 5 o'clock. We would ask you to respond promptly. This hearing is adjourned.
Kennedy begins with a pointed but carefully structured inquiry into Governor Beevanen's controversial pardons. His questioning of Mr. Meredith, who served as one of Beevanen's lawyers, highlights two constitutional and political dimensions of the pardon power. The pardon power in state governments mirrors that of the federal level. Governors are generally granted wide discretion to issue pardons, often without significant checks. At the federal level, Article 2 of the Constitution vests the president with the power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. This power has historically been interpreted broadly, allowing presidents to pardon even the most politically controversial figures. By pointing to the FBI investigation into the pardons, Kennedy highlights the uneasy relationship between law enforcement oversight and the absolute discretion inherent in the pardon power. Meredith carefully distances himself from the controversy, noting that the one pardon he advised against, for Irvin Edge, was ultimately granted by the governor. The implication is subtle but telling. Legal advisors may counsel caution, but ultimately, political and personal considerations often override legal advice in the pardon process. Kennedy's rhetorical strategy here is not about whether the pardons were legal. They were. Instead, it's about testing the nominee's judgment under pressure. Can Meredith acknowledge the limits of his own influence while affirming the legality of gubernatorial discretion? His answer reflects restraint. The system permits governors to ignore even the best legal advice. This exchange sets the tone for the rest of the hearing. Kennedy is not content to accept surface-level legal explanations. He wants to push nominees into the murky waters where law, politics, and morality collide. Kennedy pivots sharply to a First Amendment hypothetical involving the New York Times. Suppose the Times publishes an editorial attacking him personally, calling him, in his colorful phrasing, an ignorant slut. Could the Times refuse to publish a rebuttal? Could it refuse to sell him ad space to defend himself? This line of questioning forces Meredith to grapple with the scope of press freedom and the doctrine of editorial discretion. The First Amendment provides Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. Courts have consistently held that the press enjoys broad editorial discretion in deciding what to publish. The seminal case here is Miami Herald Publishing Co. versus Tornillo, 1974, in which the Supreme Court struck down a Florida law requiring newspapers to provide a right of reply to political candidates criticized in print. The court ruled that compelling newspapers to print replies infringes on their editorial freedom, effectively making them a government-controlled mouthpiece. Meredith implicitly channels this precedent, suggesting that the Times could indeed deny Kennedy both a letter to the editor and a paid ad. The First Amendment protects not just the right to publish, but the right not to publish. Kennedy's point, however, is not about abstract doctrine. It is about the perceived unfairness of the asymmetry. The press can attack a public figure without being compelled to offer equal space for defense. For Kennedy, this raises a normative question about whether free speech protections tilt too far in favor of institutional media power at the expense of individual voices. This is a classic Kennedy maneuver. Take a settled constitutional principle and expose the real-world inequities it produces. It is not that he misunderstands the doctrine, he is fully aware of Tornillo. Rather, he forces the nominee to justify why the principle produces outcomes that seem intuitively unjust. Kennedy next shifts to federalism, testing Mr. Mercer with the question, could Congress preempt local zoning laws to address housing shortages? Mercer responds cautiously but firmly, no. Zoning is a quintessential local police power, regulating health, safety, and welfare, and the Constitution does not grant Congress the authority to take over zoning under Article 1. Kennedy presses, on what basis? Mercer invokes the 10th Amendment, which reserves to the states powers not delegated to the federal government. This is consistent with Supreme Court precedent. In cases like Village of Euclid versus Ambler Realty Co. 1926, zoning has long been upheld as a local matter. The political stakes here are profound. America faces a housing affordability crisis, and many policy advocates argue that local zoning restrictions, particularly exclusionary zoning, are a key driver. If Congress could override local zoning, it could open the door to dramatic housing reform. Kennedy's question thus probes the outer limits of federalism, where local autonomy collides with national needs. This hearing exchange with Senator John Kennedy is a case study in how constitutional law is tested not just in courtrooms, but in the political arena of Senate confirmation hearings. By moving from pardons to press freedom, from zoning to takings, Kennedy demonstrates how constitutional doctrines are not isolated silos, but interconnected frameworks that shape the everyday lives of Americans. The larger lesson is clear. The Constitution is not a static document. Its meaning is constantly being renegotiated through the interplay of doctrine, politics, and lived experience. Kennedy's humor may draw attention, but beneath it lies a serious project, exposing the fault lines in American law and forcing nominees and the public to confront the contradictions that lie at the heart of constitutional governance.